Morgue workers, pathologists, medical examiners. Weirdest cause of death? I'm an apprentice funeral director, but we had an autopsy tech come into my school once to do an autopsy demonstration. He was asked this very question, and this was his answer. Male, mid-50s, presented with jaundice and other signs of alcoholism, but supposedly no history of drinking. During preliminary observation, techs noted a red liquid coming from the anal area. Assuming blood, it was tested, came back as red wine and blood. Turns out the deceased was a closet alcoholic who would give himself enemas with whatever alcohol he had. In this case, red wine. The doctors concluded he pierced part of his colon/rectum with whatever he enemed himself with and led to a bleed. This is a pretty wild story. It's unexpected how people can hide things about their lives. The details about the enema and the red wine are surprising too. It shows how important it is to look at everything during an autopsy. There's always more beneath the surface, literally and figuratively. Was a police officer and helped with a case where there was a guy in his 50s who died laying on his couch. He had told friends he wasn't feeling well for a couple days and figured it was some cardiac-related event. Nope. Ready for an irrational fear? Guy had undiagnosed hemochromatosis, high iron, that destroyed his liver, his ongoing cirrhosis, and the liver's inability to process blood as fast as it was being pumped caused varicose veins in the lining of his esophagus. This was a decades-long process. One day, one or more of the esophageal varices ruptures, and the guy slowly bleeds to death through his digestive system while thinking he had a stomach bug or something, only to die taking a nap. Get regular physicals, folks. This story shows how serious health issues can go unnoticed for a long time. The guy thought he was just having a stomach bug, but it turned out to be a life-threatening condition. It's a reminder that regular checkups are important for catching these problems early before it's too late. Health can be tricky, and sometimes subtle signs can lead to major issues down the line. Stay aware. I'm a criminal defense attorney. Had a client charged with murder for essentially getting into a shoving match with a guy. No external bruising or scratching. No evidence of trauma anywhere. They opened his head and found a subarachnoid hemorrhage. Turned out he had a ton of booze and blow in the tox report. The coke had constricted the blood vessels and driven the blood pressure up, and the booze had thinned the blood out. When he bumped his head slumping back, that was all it took, and he blew out and was dead in less than a minute. Really sad case. There's a lot going on here. The situation escalated quickly from a simple altercation to a tragic outcome. It's interesting how substance use played a role in the incident. The body's reaction with those factors involved is wild, but makes sense in hindsight. It's hard to see how a moment can lead to something so serious. Really shows the consequences of actions, even if they seem minor at the time. Well, not a dead body, but I was a security guard at a hospital in Alaska. One of my duties was to bring deceased folk to the morgue, so I had a key to it. Get a radio call that some patient's wife wants her husband's wedding ring back. I assumed it would be on a deceased person. I go to the morgue to look for it. I look all over, no gold ring. I even open the coolers, no bodies. I then look in the fridge, body parts, and a little igloo cooler. I look inside that. It looks like very old banana peels. I glove up and pull some out. Turns out this guy had gotten his hand shredded in machinery. I had to get the mangled ring off his mangled hand and clean it off and go give it to him. That's pretty wild. Working in a morgue can bring a lot of unexpected moments. Finding a ring on a hand like that must have been a weird experience. It's strange to think about the everyday stuff that goes on in a hospital. The whole situation shows how you never really know what to expect on the job. Just another day in the life, I guess. Back in med school, during internship at the coroners, I saw a case when a man in his late 50s was found dead at home, although under quite peculiar circumstances. His body was found standing. Yes, standing in the bedroom with one leg raised and resting on the bed, basically as if he wanted to climb on the bed but suddenly died. Further examination led to a severe heart attack as the most likely cause of death. However, no evidence of someone moving the body post-mortem could be found. The conclusion was that either someone would have to have found him quite early and basically hold the corpse for hours until it became stiff enough to stand on its own, or that his death was so sudden that it happened just in the right moment so that his body would be perfectly balanced and not fall over. That's an interesting case. The idea of a body standing like that is pretty rare. It raises a lot of questions about what happened in those final moments. The heart attack angle makes sense, but the positioning adds a layer of mystery. It's strange to think about how sudden death can lead to such unusual scenarios. Makes you wonder about the science behind it. I'm not a medical professional or a mortician, but I think this story is relevant to the question, so I'll share it anyway. A few weeks ago, I was driving a guy to a hospital 3 hours away. He was a truly amazing man and regaled me with a myriad of fascinating tales of his youth and previous jobs. He got on to explaining his family and how he had 2 nephews but now only had 1. I asked him what happened. Apparently, his eldest nephew, around 28, was riding his motorbike on a weekend out in the countryside here in the UK. They found him later that day, dead, on the side of the road on a corner, motorbike next to him, with no obvious signs of impact or anything that could possibly have led to his death. It took a long time for them to work out what had happened. Eventually, they found a small bruise about ½ an inch in width on his temple. After some investigation, they discovered that the corner of road had just been resurfaced and had some loose stones on top. They concluded that as he rounded the corner at about 30 miles per hour, the bike had slid from underneath him. As he rolled to the side of the road, the footrest of the bike had entered the corner of the helmet through the hole where the visor was open and hit him in the temple, killing him instantly. Nothing reckless, no one else involved, just bad luck. Sometimes that's all you need. That's a tough story. It shows how quickly things can change. A ride that should have been a normal day turned tragic due to a small detail. Just a reminder that life can be unpredictable. It's sad for the family and highlights the risks that can come with riding, even when you're careful. Sometimes the smallest things can lead to the biggest consequences. My father was a field agent for a medical examiner's office in Texas for about 25 years, and on rare occasion, recounted some of the experiences from the job to me. Most cases in the county for which he worked were natural deaths, suicides, or traffic accidents. His first case, however, was a very unusual homicide. The victim was a postal worker who had been struck with an axe by a teenage boy. It turned out that the boy had been lured into the postman's home and was being sexually assaulted when a struggle ensued. The boy grabbed an axe in the home and swung at the postman, killing him. Freaked out, the boy called 911, reported the body, and my dad showed up. There are other tales from the ME's office my dad shared with me, but they're either not interesting for their means/causes of death, were used as cautionary tales against me being an idiot teenager, don't buy a motorcycle, wear a seatbelt, etc., or don't have to do with somebody in particular dying, e.g. Some serious examples of gallows humor. TLDR, my dad worked in the medical examiner's office in TX, and his first case was an axe murder. That's quite a story about your dad's work. His first case, being such a shocking homicide, must have made a lasting impression on him. It's interesting how he balanced the heavier cases with less dramatic ones while still trying to teach you some lessons. Seems like working in that field would give a person a unique perspective on life and death. Just another reminder of how unpredictable things can get. X-ray tech here. Heard from a fellow employee. X-ray tech did a chest X-ray on a male in the ICU with severe pneumonia. He was barely able to get a breath. On an X-ray, his lungs were completely white. White means dense, hard material, like bone or metal. Lungs are a mixture of black, air, and gray, tissue/mucus. The X-ray tech is puzzled by the complete whiteness, wondering what kind of material it is or what happened to his lungs, so he called the doc for a medical history. The doc replied thusly, "Patient was on a bender, looking for drugs. He broke into his neighbor's garage and found a batch of powder in his neighbor's fishing tackle box and snorted the whole thing. A few days later, he developed pneumonia. It turns out that the fisherman neighbor's sister had died years ago, and the fisherman kept her ashes in his tackle box, so she went with him whenever he went fishing, just like when she was alive. The patient had snorted the leftover metallic ash of his neighbor's dead sister. He died a week later. That's a pretty wild story. It's strange how drugs can lead to such unexpected and tragic situations. The details about the ashes and the whole context really add a level of shock to it. It's a reminder of how fragile life is and how choices can have serious consequences. The poor guy didn't see that coming. Quite a grim ending for everyone involved. This is a story that was told to me by my college professor and then strangely verified by my father. Back when my professor was a med student, he used to go watch autopsies, as a med student generally does. One day, he walks in on a fat, bearded man from Connecticut of an approximate age of about 70. He was also very much dead. The cause of death was technically an implication of the heart, but when they started to explore his feet, which were covered in large welts, they found massive deposits of calcium crystals, which had begun to form in the legs and feet of the man. Initially, they thought it was a very strange case of the very mundane condition calcium pyrophosphate deposition, until they found a massive collection of calcium crystals, and my professor swears they were crystals in the foot of the man. Now, this would take a lot of calcium. According to my professor, about the equivalent of eating a small pack of Tums a day, or whatever those antacids are called. That Christmas, I was home telling my family about this strange story, when my father, who was a young engineer in Connecticut at about the time this story would have taken place, and he used to work with a bearded, 70-year-old man who ate a jar of Tums every day until he died. There is slightly more to this story, as I pretty much did verify the men both my dad and professor knew were one and the same, but I am eating pizza, and I have work in less than an hour, and I need to make this quick. That's an interesting story. The connection between the professor's findings and your dad's acquaintance is pretty unusual. It's wild to think about how something as mundane as antacids could lead to such extreme outcomes. The details about the calcium deposits really stand out. People often overlook what they consume. Makes you wonder what else could be lurking in everyday habits. I run a forensic science summer program for high school students, and we take them on field trips, one of them being a forensic medical center. The me there said that he once had a body come in without a head. The man apparently was decapitated, and his body was then dumped in the river. The kicker is, though, that the killer was the boyfriend of the victim. His boyfriend was found to be in possession of his dead boyfriend's head. The head had traces of semen in it. The stomach contents did not. Edit. Semen. I have no excuse. Edit 2. The murderer was the victim's boyfriend, not the ME's. That's a pretty crazy story. A decapitated body and the killer being the boyfriend adds a lot of drama. The details about the head being found with traces of semen and the stomach contents is just bizarre. It's wild how some cases can be so complicated and dark. Definitely makes for a memorable field trip experience for the students. Bet they'll remember this one for a long time. My father has been a me/forensic pathologist, meaning his specialty is disease, but is also very well versed in all manner of deaths and trauma, especially bullet wounds and knife wounds, for many years. Unfortunately, I am unable to get in contact with him at the moment, otherwise I'm sure he would have a field day on this thread. Being the kid of a ME is weird. When my dad would pick me up from school, it would not be uncommon for him to be on the phone with an official saying something along the lines of, "Oh yeah, he shot her in the back with a 12 gauge. Yes, the kids too. Into the phone. Or when I asked him how his day was, he would say things like, "Well, I had another obese dude today, so I'm really tired." I also remember finding a picture of a dead baby when I was setting the table for dinner. If I can get in contact with him before this is over, I'll add some of his stories to this comment. He's a super good storyteller and a competent writer, unlike myself. Update. I got in contact with my dad. He's a little cautious and a Luddite at heart, so he wants to dictate his stories to me and then review them before I post them. I'll be seeing him on Monday, if all goes as planned. Hopefully I'll have some interesting causes of death to share by Monday evening. Update 2. Due to issues of privacy, my father has refused to contribute. He did so at the last minute, saying that he didn't feel comfortable. I would like to apologize to all the people who were following for a story. I would like you all to know that because of this comment, I was able to have a wonderful conversation with my father that, although fruitless in Reddit story cred, really invited my father to open up to me about some of the more intricate difficulties that come with the job of autopsy. That's an interesting family dynamic. It must be pretty unique having a forensic pathologist as a dad. Hearing those phone calls and dealing with those experiences would definitely shape your perspective on life and death. It's cool you got to have a conversation with him, even if it didn't lead to a story for Reddit. Those discussions can be meaningful in their own way. Hope you get more insights in the future. I'm an RN in the aged care field. We had a resident who was at the end of her life with ovarian cancer. She had ascites, buildup of fluid in the peritoneal cavity causing the abdomen to swell. She died when somehow her peritoneal cavity and then her stomach or something else ruptured, causing all of the light brown colored odorless fluid to gush out of her mouth and nose, and there was a lot of it. She had been lying there talking and then said she fell off, and not long afterwards it happened. But I like to think that she wasn't conscious when it happened because her face was very blank and her eyes vague throughout the process, but man, that wouldn't be a nice way to go. That's a tough situation. End-of-life care can be hard to witness, especially with something so distressing. It's good that you're there for the residents, but it sounds like this was quite a heavy moment. It's understandable to hope she wasn't aware of it. Helping people in those final moments must be challenging, yet in some ways it's part of life.